The last thing Charlotte's grandparents ever told her was, "Sometimes the biggest betrayals come wrapped in the prettiest packages, dear." At the time, she had smiled, nodding as if she understood, but the words had settled in the back of her mind like a faint echo, a riddle she couldn't quite solve. They had been sitting on the sun-drenched porch of the Victorian estate in Fairhaven, a place that had always felt more like home than anywhere else. Her grandmother, Eleanor Garrison, had spoken the words in her usual soft, knowing tone, her fingers curled around a delicate teacup. Her grandfather, Henry, had merely given Charlotte a long, measured look before nodding in agreement. Charlotte had dismissed it then. A lesson about life, perhaps, or one of their many cryptic ways of preparing her for the world. She hadn't thought much of it until they were gone. Their passing had come suddenly, heartbreakingly. A car accident, the authorities had said. A freak incident on the winding road leading into town. One moment, they were alive, hosting one of their legendary garden parties, and the next, they were gone, leaving behind an empty house filled with whispers of the past. Charlotte had barely had time to grieve before the chaos began. The estate, the inheritance, the sudden shift in her family's behavior, it had all felt like a blur, like someone had pulled the rug out from under her feet and left her suspended in freefall. She had spent most of her childhood in this house, a grand old home with creaky wooden floors, a wraparound porch, and ivy that crawled up the sides as if trying to reclaim it. Her parents, Lillian and Gerald, had always been distant, more concerned with their business than with raising children. It was her grandparents who had taught her how to ride a bike, how to bake cookies in the sunlit kitchen, how to listen for the secrets the wind carried through the trees. More than that, they had promised her that the house would always be hers. Since she was 12, they had made it clear that this was meant to be her home. "One day, this will be yours, Charlie," her grandfather had said, ruffling her hair as they sat in the sunroom one lazy afternoon. "But why me?" she had asked. Her grandmother had smiled, the corners of her eyes crinkling. "Because you love it the way we do. You see more than just walls and windows. You see the heart of this place." But now, as she stood in the grand hallway of the house, running her fingers along the banister, she felt something she had never felt here before: uncertainty. The house felt different. Not in the way that things do after someone dies, but in a way that made her uneasy, like there was something beneath the surface she had yet to uncover. The usual warmth was gone, replaced by a lingering sense of something unfinished. She wandered through the rooms, trailing her hands over the furniture, the old bookshelves filled with memories, the worn-out chairs her grandfather used to sit in while reading the paper. Everything felt frozen in time, untouched since their passing. In the corner of the study, the old grandfather clock ticked steadily, a rhythmic reminder of time moving forward even when she wasn't ready. Charlotte exhaled slowly, pulling her cardigan tighter around her. Maybe it was just grief, making everything feel heavier, more distorted. Maybe it was just the weight of losing the two people who had always made her feel safe. She made her way to the sunroom, the place she had always loved most. It was filled with soft golden light, casting long shadows over the wooden floors. The glass panels overlooked the sprawling garden, where her grandmother's roses still bloomed defiantly. Sitting down on the window seat, Charlotte closed her eyes, letting herself sink into the quiet. And then, a memory surfaced, one that sent a strange chill through her. Her grandparents had been acting strangely in the weeks before their accident. At the time, she had chalked it up to old age, or maybe just a quiet sort of worry they didn't want to burden her with. But now, looking back, she could see the tension in the way her grandfather's hands had gripped the armrest of his chair, the flickers of something unspoken passing between them when they thought she wasn't looking. And then there were the hushed conversations, the ones she had caught snippets of but never questioned. "It has to be her," her grandmother had whispered one evening. "I know, Eleanor." But what if her grandfather had started, but the sound of Charlotte entering the room had cut him off? She had laughed about it then, assuming they were discussing something mundane, something harmless. But now, she wasn't so sure. Her fingers curled against the fabric of her sleeve as she stared out at the garden, a sense of unease creeping up her spine. Had they been trying to warn her about something? The words came back to her again, stronger this time. Sometimes the biggest betrayals come wrapped in the prettiest packages, dear. Her chest tightened as she swallowed hard, glancing toward the doorway as if expecting someone to be standing there. Her grandparents had always been careful, always thoughtful. If they had left her with a warning, it wasn't for nothing. And for the first time since their passing, Charlotte had the sinking feeling that whatever they had been trying to protect her from, it hadn't disappeared with them. It was still here, lurking in the shadows of this house, waiting for her to uncover it. The air in the law office felt thick, pressing against Charlotte's chest like an invisible weight. She sat at the long mahogany table, her hands curled into fists on her lap, trying to steady her breathing. The room was dim, the soft glow of the chandelier above doing little to ease the coldness settling in her bones. She had been expecting grief. She had been expecting the ache of finality as her grandparents' will was read aloud. What she hadn't expected, what she could have never prepared for, it was betrayal. Her brother, Colin, leaned back in his chair, arms crossed over his chest, wearing the same smug expression he always did when he knew something she didn't. Her sister, Madeline, sat stiffly beside him, refusing to meet Charlotte's eyes. And then there were her parents. Lillian, their mother, had a well-rehearsed look of concern on her face, the same one she wore whenever she was about to deliver bad news while pretending it was for someone else's benefit. Gerald, their father, had chosen avoidance, keeping his gaze locked on the table as if this were just another business transaction. It might as well have been. "Wait," Charlotte said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You sold the house?" The lawyer, an older man with wire-rimmed glasses, cleared his throat before speaking. "Your parents executed the sale of the Fairhaven estate shortly after your grandparents' passing. As the legal power of attorney, they had the authority to do so." "No," Charlotte said, shaking her head, the words not making sense. "That's not possible. That house was supposed to be mine. They promised me." Lillian gave her a pitying look. "Charlotte, I know this is difficult." "You sold the house," Charlotte repeated, her voice louder this time, rising with disbelief. "Without telling me?" Her mother sighed. "You wouldn't have agreed to it, and quite frankly, we didn't want to burden you with the responsibility. The market is volatile, and we needed to act quickly." "Burden me?" Charlotte's laugh was hollow, a bitter sound that didn't belong to her. "It wasn't a burden. It was my home." She turned to her father, hoping desperately that he would at least look at her. But Gerald simply ran a hand through his graying hair, his lips pressing into a tight line. Her gaze snapped to Colin instead, who smirked. "Honestly, Charlotte, what did you expect? You barely scrape by as it is. You think you could afford to maintain a Victorian estate?" Charlotte felt like she had been slapped. The words cut deeper than they should have, twisting into the insecurities she tried so hard to ignore. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to stay composed. "It wasn't about money. It was about what they wanted." Madeline finally spoke, her voice quiet. "Legally, they could sell it. The estate was in their name. Grandmother and grandfather never transferred it to you." Charlotte's breath caught in her throat. "That's not true." But Madeline nodded, her expression laced with something like guilt. "It is. I checked the records." The truth settled in Charlotte's stomach like a stone. It wasn't just that they had taken something from her. It was that they had done it so easily, without hesitation, without remorse. She looked at her mother again. "How could you do this?" Lillian's expression hardened. "Because we had to. The money from the sale was necessary." Charlotte frowned. "Necessary for what?" A pause, a flicker of something unreadable in Lillian's eyes. Then she shook her head. "It doesn't matter now. What's done is done." But it did matter. It mattered more than anything. Charlotte forced herself to take a deep breath, her hands trembling as she placed them on the table. "Who bought it?" "The buyer wishes to remain anonymous," the lawyer said, adjusting his glasses. That set off alarm bells in her head. Anonymous buyers weren't unheard of, but why would someone go through the trouble of buying a historic home in Fairhaven without wanting their name attached to it? Unless there was something else at play. She turned to Colin. You knew, didn't you? His smirk widened. Of course I knew. I was there when the paperwork was finalized. Charlotte's fingers curled into fists. You all knew. And not one of them had told her. The betrayal was staggering, cutting deeper than any wound she had ever known. You had no right, she said, her voice breaking despite her best efforts. None of you had any right. Her mother sighed, exasperated. Charlotte, enough. This is done. You need to move on. But Charlotte couldn't move on. Not when her grandparents had trusted her. Not when she had spent her entire life believing that this house would be hers, not just because of some inheritance, but because it was where she belonged. Her mind was spinning, her vision blurring at the edges as she tried to make sense of it all. And then, the lawyer handed her an envelope. This was left for you, he said. Her fingers trembled as she took it. The paper was thick, familiar. Her grandmother's stationery. Her breath caught. She didn't open it. Not yet. Not here. Instead, she stood, pushing back her chair so suddenly that it scraped against the floor. I'm not done with this, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Not by a long shot. Then she turned and walked out of the room, leaving the weight of their betrayal behind, at least for now. As she stepped out into the cold evening air, clutching the envelope to her chest, she knew one thing for certain. Her grandparents had known this would happen. And they had left her something. Something that could change everything. Charlotte gripped the envelope tightly as she hurried away from the law office, the night air cool against her flushed skin. Her heart pounded, a mixture of anger, confusion, and something else, hope. Her grandparents had left her something. A final message. A secret. She didn't open it right away. Not here, not under the streetlights with the weight of her family's betrayal still suffocating her. She needed privacy. Somewhere safe. 20 minutes later, she sat cross-legged on the floor of her small apartment, her hands shaking as she finally tore open the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of thick ivory paper, the handwriting immediately recognizable. Her grandmother's elegant cursive, written with the same steady hand that had penned countless birthday cards and recipes over the years. Dearest Charlie, if you are reading this, then the worst has come to pass. We feared this might happen, but we hoped we were wrong. You must listen carefully now, sweetheart. Not everything is as it seems. You have been betrayed, yes, but you are not powerless. We made sure of that. There is something waiting for you. A truth that will set things right. Behind the loose brick in the garden wall, the one you used to hide your childhood treasures, you will find what you need. Trust yourself, Charlie. And be careful. With love always, grandfather and grandmother. Charlotte's breath hitched. The loose brick. Memories flooded back, hot summer afternoons spent playing in the garden, her little hands prying that very brick loose to tuck away tiny secrets, a lucky penny, a crumpled note, a stolen cookie from the kitchen. She never thought much of it. It had just been a quirk of the old house. But her grandparents had remembered. And they had used it to hide something important. Charlotte was already on her feet, pulling on her coat before she even realized what she was doing. She didn't care that it was nearly midnight, didn't care that she had to sneak back onto the estate like a trespasser. This was her home. Or at least, it should have been. The drive to Fairhaven was long, the winding roads dark and empty. By the time she pulled up in front of the Grand Victorian house, her hands were clammy, her pulse quick. The house loomed in the moonlight, its once welcoming presence now shadowed by betrayal. Charlotte took a deep breath, forcing herself forward. The garden was just as she remembered, wild, overgrown in some places, but still beautiful. The roses her grandmother had loved so much were in bloom, their scent thick in the air. Charlotte crouched by the garden wall, running her fingers along the rough brickwork. It took her only seconds to find it, the one brick that had always been just a little looser than the rest. Her nails scraped against the edges as she pried it free. Inside, tucked carefully in the hollow space, was a small metal box. Her breath caught as she pulled it out, her fingers trembling as she flipped open the latch. Inside were documents. A key. And another note. This is your proof. The house was meant to be yours. They cannot take what they never had. Charlotte's stomach twisted as she flipped through the papers. Legal documents. A clause in her grandparents' will, one that had been altered 6 months before their passing. The house could not be sold without Charlotte's explicit written consent. Her breath came in short gasps as the truth settled over her like a heavy weight. Her family had no right to sell this house. They had lied. Charlotte pressed her fingers to her lips, swallowing the lump in her throat. It wasn't just about the house anymore. This was fraud. And someone, had to stop it. Her fingers tightened around the papers as she stood, her heart pounding with newfound determination. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Charlotte sat across from Isla Moreno, gripping the stack of legal documents with white-knuckled hands. The office smelled of leather and ink, the kind of place where battles were fought with signatures instead of swords. Isla was sharp-eyed and serious, a woman who didn't waste time on pleasantries. Charlotte liked that about her. The words from the letter still burned in her mind. This is your proof. They cannot take what they never had. She had barely slept since sneaking onto the estate to retrieve the documents. The night had been long, her mind racing with questions, suspicions, and the overwhelming sting of betrayal. She hadn't even told Madeline, hadn't told anyone. Because she needed to be sure. And Isla was the only person she could trust to tell her the truth. The lawyer adjusted her glasses and flipped through the papers. Her expression didn't change as she scanned them, but Charlotte saw the shift in her posture, the way her fingers tightened on the edges of the documents, the way her brows furrowed just slightly. Then she set them down with a slow exhale. This, Isla said, tapping one of the pages, changes everything. Charlotte's heart pounded. Tell me. Isla leaned back, her gaze calculating. 6 months before your grandparents passed, they made a significant amendment to their will. It states that Fairhaven cannot be sold without your explicit written consent. Charlotte inhaled sharply. So the sale should be impossible, Isla confirmed. And yet, she picked up another document, the one from the reading of the will, the one where her family had finalized the sale. She turned it toward Charlotte. Your signature is right here. Charlotte stared at the signature, a sick feeling creeping into her stomach. It was her name. The letters curled in the same way she always wrote them. The slant, the pressure, the little loop in the T that her high school teachers had always pointed out. But she had never signed this document. Her fingers trembled as she traced the ink with her gaze. It's forged, she whispered. Isla nodded. Yes, and whoever did it was damn good. Charlotte's stomach twisted. Her own family had forged her signature. She let out a breath, trying to steady herself. Can we prove it? Isla leaned forward. Yes, but it won't be easy. Whoever did this took their time. This isn't some sloppy last-minute forgery. It's professional. They knew what they were doing. Charlotte felt lightheaded. So what do we do? Isla folded her hands on the desk. First, we verify the forgery with an expert. If we can prove your signature was falsified, we can challenge the sale in court. But that's just the legal side of things. Charlotte swallowed. What's the other side? Isla's expression darkened. This wasn't just about taking the house from you, Charlotte. This was calculated. Your family knew about this clause. They knew they couldn't sell the house legally, so they forged your consent. The question is, why? Charlotte clenched her fists. Because they wanted the money. Isla studied her. Maybe. Or maybe there's more to it. A chill ran down Charlotte's spine. Like what? Isla tapped her pen against the documents. We need to find out. If your family was willing to commit fraud to get that house off their hands, then there's something bigger at play. Charlotte's mind raced. Her parents. Colin. Even Madeline. How much did she know? And then she remembered the emails. At the will reading, Darren Caldwell, the supposed buyer, had remained anonymous. But something nagged at Charlotte now. If her family had been trying to sell the house illegally, how long had they been planning it? And why had they needed to sell so quickly? Charlotte pressed her fingers against her temples. What do we do next? Isla's voice was firm. We investigate. We talk to the buyer. We get a forensic expert to analyze the signature. And we follow the money. Charlotte nodded, trying to steel herself. She had spent so long being hurt by what her family had done. Now, she was angry. And she wasn't about to let them get away with it. Not anymore. Charlotte clenched the strap of her bag as she and Isla walked through the grand lobby of the Caldwell Holdings office. The place reeked of wealth, polished marble floors, towering glass windows, and a receptionist desk that looked like it had been carved from a single slab of obsidian. It made Charlotte feel small, but she squared her shoulders. She wasn't here to admire architecture. She was here to uncover the truth. Beside her, Isla moved with purpose. Dressed in a sharp blazer, she exuded the kind of confidence Charlotte envied. The kind of confidence she needed right now. The receptionist glanced up, flashing a professional smile. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," Isla said smoothly, "but Darren Caldwell will want to see us. Tell him it's regarding the Fairhaven estate." The receptionist hesitated, then tapped on her keyboard. After a moment, she spoke into her headset. Charlotte's stomach churned as they waited, her thoughts spiraling. Would he even talk to them? What if he was in on it? But then, the receptionist nodded. "Mr. Caldwell will see you now. 5th floor, conference room 2. Charlotte exhaled, her pulse picking up as they stepped into the elevator. Isla pressed the button without hesitation, while Charlotte stared at her reflection in the gleaming doors. She didn't recognize herself. Her usual softness had been replaced by something sharper, something determined. As the elevator doors slid open, they stepped into a quiet hallway. A man stood at the far end, waiting. Darren Caldwell. He was in his mid-40s, sharply dressed, with an air of effortless authority. His eyes were piercing, assessing Charlotte as she approached. "Miss Garrison," he said, his voice even. "And Miss Moreno, I assume?" Isla nodded. "We need to talk." Darren gestured toward the glass-walled conference room. "Let's." They stepped inside, and Charlotte took a seat across from him. Isla remained standing, sliding the forged documents onto the table. Charlotte didn't waste time. "I never signed this." Darren's gaze flickered over the paperwork. "I assumed you had." "Well, I didn't," Charlotte said, voice tight. "Which means my family committed fraud." Darren leaned back, his fingers steepled. "I had no reason to doubt them. They assured me the sale was legitimate." Charlotte inhaled sharply. "Did they now?" Isla's voice was calm but firm. "We have reason to believe Charlotte's mother was actively seeking buyers while her grandparents were still alive. That suggests intent to take control of the estate before it was legally theirs to sell." Darren's expression darkened. "I had no idea." Charlotte hesitated. "Why did you want the house?" Darren sighed, rubbing his jaw. "Because I was told it was a bargain. A rare Victorian estate, well below market value. When I asked why the price was so low, your mother told me it was due to financial strain on your family. I had no reason to question it." Charlotte's stomach twisted. "Did she say anything else? Anything suspicious?" Darren hesitated, then pulled out his phone. There were emails. He scrolled, then turned the screen toward them. "Read for yourself." Charlotte's breath caught as she scanned the messages. Her mother had been desperate to sell. Even before her grandparents died, she had been reaching out to buyers, pushing for a quick sale. And then, something chilling. "The house is valuable in more ways than one. It holds secrets we no longer wish to keep." Charlotte's fingers tightened around the phone. "What does that mean?" she whispered. Darren looked grave. "That's what I was starting to wonder." Charlotte exchanged a glance with Isla. There was more to this than money. And she was going to find out what. Charlotte paced the length of Isla's office, gripping the edges of the printed emails until the paper crinkled in her hands. The damning words stared back at her. "The house is valuable in more ways than one. It holds secrets we no longer wish to keep." She had spent her entire life in that house, and yet, she had no idea what her mother had meant. What secrets? What had they been so desperate to hide that they had resorted to fraud? Charlotte's breath was uneven as she turned back to Isla, who sat calmly at her desk, fingers tapping against the armrest of her chair. "What do we do now?" Charlotte asked, her voice tight with barely restrained fury. We wait, Isla replied. Darren has retracted his offer. He's also agreed to cooperate if this goes to court. That will put pressure on your family. Charlotte scoffed. You think they're going to break that easily? My mother is already planning her next move. Isla exhaled, leaning forward. Then we get ahead of her. As if on cue, the office door burst open. Charlotte barely had time to brace herself before Lillian Garrison stormed inside, heels clicking against the hardwood floor. Her mother was as impeccably dressed as ever, but there was no warmth in her gaze. Only cold fury. What the hell do you think you're doing, Charlotte? Lillian demanded, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. Charlotte's pulse spiked, but she forced herself to stay calm. I'm undoing your mess. Lillian's glare flicked to Isla. You had no right to involve a lawyer. Isla leaned back in her chair, unfazed. Actually, she had every right. She's the victim of fraud. Lillian scoffed. Oh, please. This is a family matter. There was no fraud. Charlotte slammed the emails onto the desk. Then explain this. Her mother's eyes flickered over the papers. For a brief second, something like surprise flashed across her face. She hadn't expected Charlotte to have proof. But then, just as quickly, her mask returned. This proves nothing, Lillian said coolly. It's business. I was securing a sale. Charlotte's hands curled into fists. Before Grandma and Grandpa were even dead? Lillian's lips pressed into a thin line. You forged my signature, Charlotte continued, her voice rising. You had no legal right to sell Fairhaven, so you faked my consent. And now you expect me to let that go? Lillian's jaw tightened. I did what was necessary. Necessary? Charlotte's voice broke. For what? A tense silence settled over the room. Then, unexpectedly, another voice spoke up. She's lying. Charlotte turned sharply. Madeline stood in the doorway, her arms crossed over her chest. Her usually poised demeanor was gone. She looked exhausted, like someone who had been carrying a weight too heavy for too long. Lillian shot her a warning glance. Maddie, go home. Madeline ignored her. She walked into the room and placed a folder on Isla's desk. I found these in Mom's office. I didn't know what they meant at first, but now I do. Isla opened the folder, scanning the documents. Her expression hardened. Charlotte leaned over, reading alongside her. Bank transfers. Large withdrawals. A loan taken against the family business, one that should never have been approved. Her stomach dropped. Garrison and Company is under investigation? Charlotte whispered. Madeline nodded grimly. The audit is coming in a few weeks. If the money isn't accounted for, our parents are in trouble. Charlotte turned back to her mother, horror dawning. You needed the sale to cover up financial fraud. Lillian's lips thinned. She didn't deny it. Charlotte's hands trembled with anger. You didn't just steal from me. You committed fraud to keep your company from collapsing. Lillian exhaled sharply. It's our family's legacy, Charlotte. Charlotte shook her head. No. Grandma and Grandpa were our family's legacy. And you stole from them too. Lillian's gaze turned icy. And what are you going to do about it? Charlotte squared her shoulders. Expose you. Her mother's eyes darkened. For the first time, a flicker of something like fear crossed her face. Charlotte had the proof. And she wasn't backing down. Charlotte sat in Isla's car, parked just outside the Riverside Grand Hotel, watching the revolving doors with her heart lodged in her throat. The dim glow of the city lights reflected against the car's windshield, casting long shadows across the dashboard. Beside her, Isla checked her phone, then glanced up at Charlotte. You don't have to do this, she said, voice steady. I can record everything. You don't have to go in. Charlotte's hands clenched into fists in her lap. Yes, I do. Madeline had tipped her off about the secret meeting, one that their parents, Darren Caldwell, and several business associates were attending. It was the kind of meeting people had behind closed doors when they thought no one was watching. Charlotte had spent the past few weeks unraveling her family's deceit, but nothing had prepared her for this. Her parents weren't just lying. They were covering up something much bigger. She inhaled sharply and reached for the tiny recording device Isla had given her. It was sleek and discreet, small enough to fit inside the lining of her jacket. "I'll be right here," Isla said. "If things go south, text me and I'll call the police." Charlotte nodded and pushed open the car door, stepping into the cool night air. The hotel was grand, with gold-trimmed windows and chandeliers visible even from the outside. A place where people with too much money and too many secrets gathered. She strode through the entrance, forcing herself to walk like she belonged. The hotel's lounge was warm and quiet, the hum of polite conversation masking the tension bubbling under Charlotte's skin. She spotted the private event room at the far end, the doors slightly ajar. Taking a steadying breath, she moved closer, pressing herself against the wall just outside the doorway. From here, she could hear everything. Inside, her mother's voice was crisp and clear. "This deal has to go through before the audit," Lillian said. Charlotte's pulse pounded. "The house was supposed to be gone by now," Lillian continued. "But Charlotte is making things difficult." A murmur of agreement followed. Charlotte swallowed hard, forcing herself to stay still. "She's looking into the forgery," another voice said, her father's. Gerald's tone was weary, but not remorseful. "Then we have to handle it," her mother snapped. "Before she finds out about the artwork." Charlotte's heart stopped. "What artwork?" She pressed closer. A chair scraped against the floor, and Darren Caldwell spoke next. "Are you sure about this? If that house is searched and the paintings are found, we're all done." Charlotte's breath hitched. "Paintings?" She squeezed her eyes shut, willing herself to stay calm. Her mother exhaled. "Which is exactly why the house needed to be sold. Before anyone realizes what's hidden inside." Charlotte's mind reeled. Something valuable, something illegal, was hidden in Fairhaven. Darren's voice dropped lower. "If the police get involved, they'll trace it back to the smuggling ring." Smuggling. Charlotte's fingers curled into the fabric of her coat. This wasn't just about money. Her parents were involved in something criminal. She had to get out of there. Slowly, she eased away from the doorway, careful not to make a sound. But just as she turned, a voice rang out behind her. "Charlotte." Her stomach plummeted. She turned slowly to see Madeline standing a few feet away, her expression torn between shock and something else, relief. "You heard everything, didn't you?" Madeline whispered. Charlotte's throat was dry, but she nodded. Madeline glanced toward the meeting room, then back at Charlotte. "We need to go. Now." Charlotte didn't hesitate. Together, they hurried toward the exit, Charlotte's pulse racing with each step. Her entire world had just shifted. Her parents weren't just frauds. They were criminals. And now Charlotte had proof. Charlotte and Madeline barely made it to the parking lot before Madeline grabbed Charlotte's arm, her grip tight with urgency. "You can't go back to the house," she said, breathless. "Not now." Charlotte shook her off, her own pulse pounding in her ears. "I don't have a choice." "You don't understand." "I understand perfectly," Charlotte snapped. "Our parents are criminals, and they've been hiding stolen artwork in our grandparents' house." Madeline swallowed hard, glancing over her shoulder. The grand entrance of the Riverside Grand Hotel loomed behind them, its golden lights casting long shadows across the pavement. Charlotte dug into her coat pocket, her fingers curling around the tiny recorder Isla had given her. "I have everything on tape." Madeline's eyes widened. "You recorded it?" Charlotte nodded. Every word. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on them, a suffocating realization that their family was not just broken, it was rotten to the core. Madeline exhaled shakily. "I knew something was wrong. But I didn't know it was this." Charlotte clenched her jaw. "You knew about the financial fraud." Madeline flinched but nodded. "I started noticing inconsistencies in the company's books a few months ago. I confronted Mom, and she brushed it off. Then I found the loan papers." She ran a hand through her hair. "They were siphoning money from Garrison and Company. But this? Smuggling stolen artwork? I had no idea." Charlotte's stomach twisted. Their grandparents had known. That's why they had changed the will, why they had tried to protect Fairhaven from falling into the wrong hands. And now, Charlotte was in the middle of a crime so much bigger than she could have ever imagined. "We need to go to the police," Charlotte said, her voice steadier than she felt. Madeline hesitated. "That means turning in Mom and Dad." Charlotte stared at her. "You think I don't know that?" Madeline looked away, jaw tight. Whatever she was about to say was cut short by the sound of a car screeching into the parking lot. Charlotte's blood ran cold as she saw who stepped out. Lillian. Their mother's gaze locked onto them immediately, sharp and furious. Gerald was right behind her, his face blank, unreadable. Charlotte took a step back. Madeline tensed. "They know." Lillian didn't yell. She didn't need to. When she spoke, her voice was low, lethal. "Get in the car." Madeline swallowed hard, but didn't back down. "I'm not going to let you get away with this." Lillian exhaled, slow and deliberate. "You're making a mistake." "No," Charlotte said. "You did." Lillian's lips curled, but before she could say another word, another car pulled into the lot. Charlotte's heart leapt as she recognized the sleek black sedan. Isla. The lawyer stepped out, moving with quick efficiency, her sharp eyes locking onto the unfolding confrontation. "Everything all right here?" Lillian's mask slipped for the briefest second, just long enough for Charlotte to see the flicker of panic. But then, Lillian straightened, forcing her expression into cool indifference. "We were just having a family discussion." Isla's gaze didn't waver. "I think the discussion is over." Charlotte reached into her pocket and pulled out the recorder, holding it up. "This is going to the police." Lillian's eyes narrowed dangerously. Gerald, however, sighed and turned away, shaking his head. "It's over, Lillian." His voice was hoarse. Defeated. Lillian turned to him sharply. "Don't you dare." "I'm done." He looked at his daughters, something that almost resembled regret flickering in his eyes. "Let them do what they have to do." Lillian's hands clenched at her sides. For the first time, Charlotte saw something like desperation break through the cracks in her mother's composure. She was losing, and she knew it. Charlotte's pulse pounded as she turned to Isla. "Let's go." Madeline followed without hesitation, and Isla ushered them both into the car. As they pulled away, Charlotte finally allowed herself to breathe. Her family had shattered. But maybe, just maybe, that was the only way to rebuild the truth. The morning air was sharp as Charlotte stepped onto the front porch of Fairhaven, her boots clicking against the worn wooden planks. The house loomed behind her, its towering Victorian frame cast in the pale dawn light. It had always felt safe before. Now, it felt like the heart of a crime scene. Because that's exactly what it was. Behind her, Isla double-checked her bag, ensuring that the legal documents, the forged contracts, and the recording of the secret meeting were all accounted for. Madeline stood next to Charlotte, arms crossed, her jaw tight. The police would arrive soon. The search warrant had been approved. Today, the truth would finally come out. Charlotte tightened her grip on the key to the house. It felt heavier than before, like a symbol of everything her grandparents had tried to protect. "Are you ready?" Isla asked. Charlotte wasn't. But she nodded anyway. With a deep breath, she unlocked the door and stepped inside. The familiar scent of aged wood and faded roses filled her lungs. But as she walked through the grand hallway, something felt different. The warmth was gone. The memories felt tainted. Her parents had used this house as a hiding place for their crimes. And today, that would end. From the corner of her eye, she saw Madeline glancing toward the sunroom, the place their mother had hinted at in the emails. "The house is valuable in more ways than one. It holds secrets we no longer wish to keep." Charlotte turned toward the room, her heart pounding. If there was something hidden here, she needed to find it before her parents did. The sunroom had always been her favorite place growing up, floor-to-ceiling windows, golden sunlight spilling across the floor, the scent of fresh air drifting in from the garden. But now it felt like a vault. Where would they hide stolen paintings? Madeline murmured, running a hand along the wooden panels of the walls. Charlotte frowned, stepping closer. The walls were ornate, lined with delicate wooden moldings. But one section, just beneath the large bay window, looked newer. Her breath caught. "They wouldn't," she whispered. Isla frowned. "What?" Charlotte reached out and pressed against the panel. It shifted. Her pulse spiked. Madeline's eyes widened. "Oh my God." Together, they pried the panel loose, revealing a hidden compartment. And inside, Charlotte's stomach twisted as she reached in, pulling out a canvas wrapped in protective cloth. She knew, even before she unwrapped it, that this wasn't just any painting. This was priceless. The moment the fabric peeled away, Isla let out a sharp breath. "Jesus Christ," she whispered. Charlotte's fingers trembled as she stared at the artwork in her hands, a piece she had only ever seen in history books. "These aren't just stolen paintings," Isla said, voice low. "They're part of an international smuggling operation." The truth crashed over Charlotte in waves. This was why her parents had been so desperate to sell the house. This was why they had forged her signature. This was why her grandparents had changed the will, because they had found out about the stolen art. And now her parents were willing to let the entire family burn just to cover their tracks. The sound of tires screeching outside sent a bolt of panic through her. "They're here," Madeline whispered. Charlotte's blood turned to ice. She turned just in time to see Lillian and Gerald storming into the house. And Lillian's expression was deadly. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" her mother snarled, eyes locking onto the painting in Charlotte's hands. Charlotte's fingers tightened around the canvas. "Exposing you." Gerald ran a hand down his face, looking exhausted. "Charlotte, put that down." "No." Her voice was steel. Lillian's eyes burned with something dark, desperation. "You don't understand what you're doing." Charlotte let out a bitter laugh. "No, Mom. You don't understand what you've done. You forged my name. You stole from our own family. And now we know you've been hiding stolen artwork in this house." Lillian's jaw clenched. "We didn't have a choice." Charlotte's voice cracked. "Yes, you did." She took a step forward, heart pounding. "Grandma and Grandpa found out, didn't they? That's why they changed the will. They knew." Lillian's silence was confirmation. Charlotte felt her world tilt. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Did you?" The words stuck in her throat. Her grandparents had died in a car accident. Or at least, that's what they had been told. Lillian's face betrayed nothing. Charlotte's hands trembled. "You didn't." Lillian exhaled, slow and measured. "You need to put that painting down, Charlotte." Charlotte shook her head. "No, it's over." A beat of silence. Then, the sound of sirens. Lillian's mask cracked. "No," she breathed, eyes darting toward the windows. The police were here. Gerald let out a quiet curse, stepping back as the sound of car doors slamming filled the air. And then, the front door burst open. Fairhaven Police Department. Everything happened at once. Officers rushed in, guns drawn, shouting commands. Lillian turned, face twisting in panic. Gerald lifted his hands slowly, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Charlotte's breath came fast, sharp. It was really happening. Madeline grabbed her arm, pulling her away from their parents as officers swarmed the house. Isla stepped forward, handing over the evidence. It was over. Lillian was silent as they cuffed her hands behind her back. Gerald didn't fight. He just looked at Charlotte. For a moment, Charlotte thought she saw something there, remorse, maybe. Or resignation. But it was too late. As her parents were led out of the house, Charlotte exhaled. The weight of years of betrayal crashed down on her. And yet, for the first time in weeks, she felt free. The house was quiet now. Too quiet. Charlotte stood in the sunroom, the golden morning light filtering through the glass panes, illuminating the dust that swirled in the air. The place looked exactly as it had before. Nothing about the walls, the furniture, or the air itself had changed. And yet, everything felt different. The police had left an hour ago. The officers had packed up the stolen artwork, cataloged the evidence, and taken Lillian and Gerald away in handcuffs. Charlotte still wasn't sure how she felt about that. A part of her had wanted to feel victorious, to see them dragged away and feel just as swell in her chest. But all she felt was tired. Madeline sat on the old velvet couch, staring at the blank spot on the wall where one of the stolen paintings had been hidden. "It's weird," she murmured, knowing it was right there all this time. Charlotte swallowed. Yeah, they had grown up in this house, played hide-and-seek in these hallways, celebrated birthdays, holidays, countless small, ordinary moments. And all along, their parents had been hiding something dark behind the walls. Madeline rubbed a hand over her face. "Do you think she hesitated. "Do you think they had something to do with Grandma and Grandpa's accident?" Charlotte's stomach twisted. She had been avoiding that thought. She had spent years believing her grandparents had died in a simple car crash. But after everything, the forged documents, the desperation to sell the house, the smuggled artwork, it was hard not to wonder. Would Lillian and Gerald have gone that far? Charlotte's grip tightened around the edge of the window seat. "I don't know," she admitted. "But I think the police are going to find out." Madeline nodded slowly. "Yeah." Silence stretched between them. Then Madeline shifted, glancing at Charlotte hesitantly. "What happens now?" Charlotte exhaled. That was the question, wasn't it? She had fought so hard to keep the house, to prove that it had always been hers. And now it was hers. But it no longer felt like the home she had loved. "I don't know yet," Charlotte said, because that was the only truth she had left. Madeline studied her. "You could sell it." Charlotte flinched at the suggestion. "I just got it back." "I know." Madeline sighed. "But is this really where you want to live? After everything?" Charlotte didn't know. Fairhaven had always been a symbol of warmth, of safety. It had been the one place in her life that had felt truly hers. But now it was a crime scene. Madeline pushed herself up from the couch. "You don't have to decide now." Charlotte nodded. "Yeah." Footsteps sounded down the hall. Isla stepped into the sunroom, her expression unreadable. "It's done," she said simply. Charlotte's chest tightened. "What's going to happen to them?" she asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. Isla folded her arms. "They'll be charged with fraud, money laundering, and possession of stolen property. Given the scale of the smuggling ring, the charges could get worse. The FBI is involved now." Charlotte exhaled sharply. She had expected it. But hearing it out loud made it feel heavier. "What about Colin?" Madeline asked. Charlotte tensed. Her brother had been suspiciously quiet through all of this. Isla hesitated. "Colin is cooperating. He's agreed to testify against them." Charlotte blinked. "What?" Isla nodded. "He confessed to forging your signature. He claims Lillian pressured him into doing it. If he helps the investigation, his sentence will be lighter." Charlotte didn't know how to feel about that. Colin had mocked her. He had sided with their parents, made her feel small. And yet, he was still her brother. She let out a slow breath. "Fine," she muttered. "Let him testify." Madeline looked at Charlotte, surprised. "You're not mad." Charlotte laughed, but it was hollow. "Oh, I'm mad. I just don't have the energy to care anymore." Isla studied her carefully. "And what about you?" Charlotte frowned. "What do you mean?" "You've won, Charlotte." Isla's voice was gentle, but firm. "This house is yours. Your parents can't touch it anymore. But what happens now is up to you." Charlotte stared at the sunroom. At the place where she had grown up. At the place where she had fought to stay. And suddenly, she knew. "I'm keeping it," she said, the decision settling over her like stone. Madeline's brows shot up. "You sure?" Charlotte nodded. "Yes." She wouldn't let her parents ruin this place for her. She wouldn't let them win. This house had belonged to her grandparents. Now it belonged to her. And it was time to rebuild. Charlotte stood at the threshold of Fairhaven, gripping the brass doorknob with both hands. The house was hers now, legally and irrevocably, yet she still felt like a trespasser in her own home. The past few months had unraveled everything she thought she knew about her family. The lies, the betrayal, the fraud, each revelation had chipped away at the foundation of her past, leaving her with only one certainty: she could never be like them. She had fought for this house. Now, she had to decide what to do with it. Taking a steadying breath, she pushed open the door. The grand hallway greeted her with its familiar warmth, though the air still carried the ghosts of what had happened here. The police search had left things in disarray, furniture slightly out of place, scuff marks on the wooden floors, traces of a storm that had come and gone. But now, the rebuilding could begin. She moved toward the sunroom, the one place in this house that had always been hers. As the morning light streamed through the tall glass panes, she felt something shift inside her. This wasn't just a house. This was her inheritance, not in wealth, but in history. In truth. And she wouldn't let her parents' greed define it. A voice from behind startled her. "You really meant it." Charlotte turned. Madeline stood in the doorway, arms crossed, her expression torn between relief and something close to guilt. Charlotte nodded. "I'm keeping it." Madeline stepped inside, glancing around. "I still don't know how you can stay here. After everything." Charlotte exhaled slowly. "Because it's still theirs," she said, looking at the framed photograph of their grandparents on the bookshelf. "Mom and Dad don't get to take that away from me." Madeline studied her for a long moment before finally nodding. "I think Grandma and Grandpa would be proud of you." Charlotte swallowed past the lump in her throat. "I hope so." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their past settling between them. Then Madeline cleared her throat. I'm going back to New York for a while." Charlotte met her gaze. "Are you okay?" Madeline sighed, rubbing her temples. "I don't know. I still can't believe our parents did all of this. I spent my whole life trying to live up to their expectations, and now I realize I don't even know who they really are." Charlotte's chest ached. "I know." Madeline hesitated, then reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope. "I found this in Mom's desk before she was arrested. It's from Grandma and Grandpa." Charlotte's breath hitched as she took it, her fingers shaking slightly as she peeled back the seal. Inside was a letter. "Dearest Charlotte, by now you know the truth. And we're sorry, sweetheart. We're sorry for the weight this places on you, and for the pain we couldn't prevent. We never wanted our children to become what they did. We hoped they would choose differently. But in the end, we could only protect you. This house was always meant to be yours, not because of its value, but because of what it represents. It is a place of love, of family, the kind of family that we hoped you would carry forward. Revenge is sweet, but redemption is sweeter. Some families break to become stronger. You're strong, Charlie. And no matter what happens next, know that we loved you, always. Love, grandfather and grandmother." Charlotte wiped at her eyes before the tears could fall. They had known. They had seen what was coming, and even in their final moments, they had fought to protect her. She folded the letter carefully and placed it on the bookshelf beside their photo. Madeline smiled softly. "I think they would have liked how this turned out." Charlotte let out a shaky laugh. "I don't know. I think they would have hated the whole police raiding the house part." Madeline chuckled. "Yeah, that was a bit dramatic." For the first time in months, Charlotte felt a weight lift from her chest. Her parents were gone. The house was safe. And though the scars of the past still lingered, she had something she had thought she had lost forever. A future, a chance to build something new from the ruins of the past. And as she looked out at the sun-drenched garden, the ivy curling along the brick walls, she realized she was finally home.